I called the General Secretary again and said, just so you know, if you carry on with this, your funds could be sequestered. That's a matter for the courts. But don't think just because I'm Labour, I'm going to hold back on this.
And you would have sought that?
Yeah. It is a ridiculous anomaly that it's still the case that the defendant can choose the mode of trial. Rationally, there is no case whatsoever for giving the defendants a right to decide the forum to play the system. The then government, in my view, broke the law, which is very clear about the qualifications for a Lord Chancellor, by appointing Chris Grayling. He was out of his depth, and he set about wantonly destroying the probation service by a botched privatisation.
This is the Lord Chancellors, where politics meets justice. Brought to you by the University of Law. This week, I'm joined by Jack Straw. Jack Straw is a senior politician and Labour grandee who held 3 of the most important jobs in Cabinet, serving under the Labour governments of both Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. The Member of Parliament for Blackburn for 36 years until 2015, he was Home Secretary from 1997 to 2001 and Foreign Secretary from 2001 to 2006. In 2007, under Gordon Brown, he was appointed to be Lord Chancellor and Secretary of State for Justice, and is one of only 3 individuals to have served in Cabinet continuously during the Labour governments from 1979 to 2010. He was born in Essex and raised by his mother, who was a teacher, along with his 4 siblings. He won a scholarship to Brentwood School and then studied law at the University of Leeds before embarking on a career as a barrister. Early on, though, he went into politics, first as a special advisor to Labour cabinet ministers and then becoming an MP in 1979. Straw played a pivotal role in policy decisions such as the Iraq War and the introduction of the Human Rights Act, and was the first leading member of Labour to propose that it repeal its commitment to state control of industry, known as Clause 4. In his long parliamentary career, he has been drawn into various controversies, but is nonetheless respected for his pragmatism and diplomatic skills. I began by asking Jack Straw how he came to be appointed as Lord Chancellor and Justice Secretary.
I was Foreign Secretary from 2001 under Tony, and then in May 2006, Tony decided to move me to become leader of the Commons. So I did that for a year. And although I talked to him in the abstract about moving at some stage in that Parliament, which I've lasted to 2010, I wasn't happy about being moved then. He couldn't give me a decent explanation, and he subsequently, very generously in his memoir, said he was really sorry about having moved me.
Why did you not want to move at that point? Because you were right in the middle of...
Because I was enjoying the job, I was on top of it, I had things to do, plenty of things to do. And there was no, there's a kind of, one understands that if people are moved because they can't do the job, but that wasn't the case.
I think you've said subsequently he felt he needed to freshen up the look of the government.
Well, he sort of, but I think it was mainly to do with arguments or differences we had about particularly handling of the Middle East and how you handled Israel. So,
we can come back to that. Just coming to your portfolio as Justice Secretary.
So I was very happy. I've been doing that for a year, and I quite enjoyed the job, but it was a very light job compared with being Foreign Secretary or Home Secretary. And then when Gordon became Prime Minister, which was the end of June 2007, Charlie wasn't going to be appointed by Gordon for all sorts of reasons, and I was an obvious fit for the job. I knew the beat.
You'd been a barrister.
Well, I'd been a barrister. I was a bencher at Inner Temple. I'd done loads of law, more than I anticipated in the jobs I did in government.
Yes.
So it was a pretty straightforward sort of fit.
So what do you remember of it? Okay, what are your main recollections of that time as Justice Secretary?
The first thing I remember on my first full day in the job was how it felt like Groundhog Day, because there was an urgent meeting about prison numbers, and the three officials who turned up to this meeting, I knew from my period as Home Secretary when I'd been running the prisons, and they'd been doing similar jobs, except they were now a sort of grade above it. So that's that, and had to deal rather rapidly with increasing prison numbers, continuing an early release scheme, ensuring that we published full information so that we weren't bogged down with FOI requests. So I insisted that we publish all the information that we had on a regular basis, and then just trying to sort out the prison system where there'd been insufficient investment. I mean, nothing like the scale of the neglect we have now.
It's exactly coming back to where we are now, is what I was going to say.
But the difference is that the prison service had not been hollowed out in the way that it was during the period of austerity.
Looking at the situation now, I mean, what do you think the government should be doing about it then?
Well, I think Shabana Mahmood is doing all the right things, and it's an extremely difficult inheritance. And what happened was that Ken Clarke, who has it's a friend of mine, he has a reputation as a good liberal, and people smile because, Ken. Ken, however, is very, very right-wing on economic policy. He also has an obsession that there are, quotes, too many people in prison, as if there was a set number of people who ought to be in prison. There should be the minimum number of people in prison, but how many people end up in prison is a function of how many people commit crimes, and how many of those people, it's felt by the courts, not by ministers, need to go to jail.
So is the government at the moment doing the right thing in releasing a lot of prisoners?
And it's inevitable, because otherwise. But the other thing that happened was that Ken accepted huge cuts in the prison budget, partly because he thought this was a way of getting prison numbers down. Of course, it didn't get prison numbers down. It did, however, get the number of experienced prison staff down. So the number of experienced prison officers was cut by about a third. And then shortly after that, you had Mr. Grayling, who was completely unqualified for the job. And the then government, in my view, broke the law, which is very clear about the qualifications for a Lord Chancellor, by appointing Chris Grayling. He was out of his depth, and he set about wantonly destroying the probation service by botched privatisation. So roll forward, Robert Buckland, when he was Lord Chancellor, he was good. He tried, with some success, to put the pieces of the probation service back together again, but it still lacks the kind of depth that was there when I took it over in 1997.
Just finishing on now, why have we got this record number of prisoners?
Well, you've got the record number of prisoners for a variety of reasons. One is, so far as those prisoners who have committed medium-term offences, that typically those prisoners will have been tried on probation or other community punishments 6 or 7 times, so 6 or 7 court appearances for multiple offences, and they will not have got the message from that. And so it's inevitable that prison has to be the punishment of last resort. And I don't want to see more people in prison if we can avoid it, and if you can get people off crime into off the addictions, which are almost invariably part of their crimes, if they're into acquisitive crime or just general bad behaviour, and into work and with somewhere stable to live, that's fine. But sometimes you can't, or the prisoners simply won't accept the defendants won't accept that. So that's one reason why the prison numbers are up. A second reason is the very large increase in the number of sex offenders, because quite rightly people are far less tolerant of sex offenders. And the third is that there has been a drift upwards in prison lengths of sentencing, particularly for the most heinous offences. And one of the ironies affects lifers, people who convicted of murder. Now, the tariff for lifers, mandatory lifers as they're called, murderers, used to be set by the Home Secretary of the day. It's a slightly odd system, but the way it worked was pretty fair, in a fair way. So there was a recommendation in private by the sentencing judge to the Lord Chief Justice, and then from the Lord Chief Justice to the Home Secretary of the day. I don't recall an occasion where I ever overturned a recommendation from the Lord Chief. I may have asked a question or two about one or two of them. Anyway.
But that was removed, power, wasn't it?
That was removed, I think, partly under pressure from the European Court of Human Rights.
Do you think it should have been, or do you think it should still be with
it? It was a bit like the other arrangements for the Lord Chancellor who was in the Cabinet.
Anomalous.
But it worked, and it worked fairly. But there was quite a lot of pressure to have it removed. The irony is that since it's been removed, the tariffs, which are now set entirely by the trial judge with the Court of Appeal as a backstop, have increased quite substantially.
So you're saying it's a bit of an irony that we removed the role of the Home Secretary, but actually left to the courts, the sentence lengths for murder, for example, or the most heinous crimes have increased.
Yes, and the assumption was when there was a campaign to take the Home Secretary out of this would be that the judges would be more, as it were, liberal than nasty Home Secretaries. But in fact, it's
worked out to be the opposite.
Yeah, it was anomalous. It's difficult, if not impossible, to defend in public that the Home Secretary, who's in charge of the police and all of that, should have the ultimate power to determine the sentence length for the most heinous crimes. I mean, that obviously should be something dealt with by the courts. I, however, decided not to move on the issue because system wasn't broke, and I had plenty else to do, and I thought that I could contain the pressure.
Looking back to your time in this role first in particular, were there any moments that were particularly difficult to deal with?
Well, I suppose the most difficult thing that I had was in the late August 2007, when I was woken up about 6:30 in the morning at home by a private secretary to tell me that the Prison Officers Association had just called a 24-hour sort of wildcat strike of all their officers without proper notice and on a very spurious pretext as well. Anyway, that was hairy because what the prison officers were doing, first of all, they're breaking the law by striking in this way, but secondly, they were taking 80,000 prisoners hostage in order to make a point, which has nothing to do with the prisoners, about their pay. So thankfully, because I was by that stage pretty experienced, and I'd had 4 years of dealing with the POA before that, I decided to be quite cool about it, but calculated. So I gave instructions to my office to get the lawyers working on getting an injunction against the POA. I called the General Secretary of the POA and said to him that he needed to call off this action, otherwise the consequences for him and his union could be really severe, without spelling these out too much.
And what were you planning?
Because the courts would have ordered them back to work if they'd broken that. Their funds would have been at risk, and I'm afraid I was.
So you brazened it out with them.
So anyway, I had a visit to make to a suburban court, which I decided I'll make that, so otherwise it will appear as though we're panicking. Kept in touch on the phone, got the lawyers working, got the injunction by about 2:00, and then called the General Secretary again and said, just so you know, if you carry on with this, your funds could be sequestered. That's a matter for the courts. But don't think that just because I'm Labour, I'm going to hold back on this.
And you would have sought that.
Yeah. They were. What had happened was it had been unlawful for the prison officers to strike. It would be a criminal offence. Then, under a concession made by David Blunkett, for which I fully understand, that it was agreed to lift that restriction, but in turn, the POA would enter into a contractual arrangement by which they agreed not to strike. So it amounted to the same thing. The POA then broke that. So alongside getting the prison officers back to work, which I did very quickly under the threat of the injunction, I then thought, right, we can't have this again. So I moved very quickly, but in secret, to get, this never leaked, to get the Cabinet on board for a change in the law. Once I got that agreed, and there was a bill going through which I could add this to, I announced that, I think on the Monday or Tuesday, and said we were tabling the amendments the next day, and we'd have the vote the day after. And
what specifically did that do? Outlaw their ability to
their ability
strike.
To strike. I mean, for the same reason that the police don't strike. Or
do you think that they thought, as you say, that you, being Labour, would never take such a move?
I don't think they thought it through at all.
No.
The consequence of this was that they ended up in a worse position. But what I'm also clear about, if I hadn't had the experience that I had going back to the time when I was Home Secretary, this probably wouldn't have happened. But I got the Tories on board. That was pretty straightforward. And in the end, I think that when it went to the vote in the Commons, there were about 440 MPs of both sides. They voted for the change, and 40 from the Labour campaign group and one or two other MPs who voted against, but I wanted a vote because I knew I'd get huge numbers, which just proved that where parliamentary sentiment was.
24 hours the prison officers were out for. So who ran the prisons in that time?
So the governors and and they called in other staff as well, basically to ensure that the prisoners had exercise, and above all, they got fed. So the POA were only represent the kind of uniformed prison officers. That don't represent the prison governors. And there are plenty of other staff inside a prison who
so it did just about manage to keep going in that time.
For example, in Lancaster Farms, which is a youth offenders institution, and they are amongst the most difficult to run because you've got young men who are typically 18 to 21 who are often very strong physically, but very immature emotionally and full of anger. There was a fire near riot in one of the wings. I went up there after this to talk to the prison officers and ask them what they thought about this, and because it really was very far from sensible. And they were the POA were very unclear about what it was they wanted. But I think it was all to do with their fetid internal politics.
In that job also, you had to deal a lot with the judges. Yes. How did you find that? Did you enjoy it? Did you get on with them?
I knew quite because I'd had to deal with the Lord Chief when I was Home Secretary. So this was anomalous. At that stage, the Home Office was responsible not only for crime and police and things, but it was also responsible for criminal law. but in addition for the magistrates' court. So we ran the magistrates' courts and not the Lord Chancellor's department. So I used to have regular bilaterals with the Lord Chief. I was really pleased that Inner Temple made me a bencher back in 1997. I used to go to events there. I've always taken an interest in sort of lawyers' law.
Yes. The judges at the time you were dealing with them were just settling into their new role, and they were getting used to the idea that they were running their own show and they didn't have a Lord Chancellor speaking for them in cabinet. So did you find them in a kind of defensive mode? I mean, what kind of mood were they in at that time? Can you remember?
They were anxious, it's fair to say. And there was considerable anger amongst the senior judiciary about the way in which the act had been pushed through. Now, they knew I wasn't responsible. I had an alibi for this. I was abroad at the time. I was Foreign Secretary. I had absolutely nothing whatever to do with it. But it was the case that the senior judiciary, found out about the changes that were being announced, which went into the Constitutional Reform Act, very late in the day.
They hadn't been consulted.
No, they'd not been consulted in advance, and they were very angry about that. And one of the consequences of that was that they produced this really long kind of protocol of relationships with government. I mean, it's a bit like a commercial contract. Nick Phillips had worked on commercial law, shipping law, where an awful lot of stuff is contractual. But I said I'd do my best to observe this. But I also suggested to them that it really depended on personal relationships. So it wasn't going to come down to what subparagraph, subclause X says on page 15 of the document.
Yes, but you went along. You managed to smooth their ruffled feathers.
Yes, it was. I understood their anxiety. I wasn't there, so I couldn't say whether it was right or not.
Do you think it was the right arrangement? I mean, the reforms in general, and the moving of prisons into the same department as courts, legal aid.
I mean, the two things. One, the old system of having a Lord Chancellor who was a member of the cabinet, who was the Speaker of the House of Lords, and who was a judge. And Derry Irvine actually sat on the Lord Lords bench, which is a pretty extraordinary thing to do. You couldn't possibly justify it by any constitutional principles, because where was the separation of power there? Now, in fact, it worked all right, but it was one of these things. It was only justifiable as long as no one put a spotlight on it. But the other thing was that and this is ad hominem, Tony Blair, who'd been very close to Derry Irvine, because Derry had, I think, been his pupil master, and these relationships can be close, had thought that Derry had sort of overstayed his welcome as a Lord Chancellor, felt that there needed to be this change, but Derry was unwilling to make it.
No, so he had to go.
So he needed to go, and then Charlie Faulkner came in to get the legislation through. Look, I think that change was a very sensible one. The other area where there was concern by the senior judiciary, and also I had some concerns as well, was the lurch that had taken place over judicial appointments. I wasn't interested in it having any say whatever in appointments up to and including the High Court bench. But I certainly thought that in practice, excluding the Lord Chancellor from any effective say over the really senior appointments was very unwise.
Do you think the Lord Chancellor now has sufficient say? I mean, it's done by the Judicial Appointments Commission. That was what was set up under the reforms. I think there is a veto. It could be used.
Well, I tried to use that over the appointment of the head of the
Family Division, wasn't it? Yes.
And because there was a candidate for that position who I thought wouldn't be able to do the job, Nothing whatever to do with politics. There was a piece in the Times.
Was it? Yes, I remember this. Now, was it Sir Nicholas Wall you didn't think was suitable? I did.
Yes, right. Suggesting that it was politics. Absolutely nothing to do with politics. I had no idea what his politics were.
What was the reason you didn't think
I didn't think that I knew him a bit. I'd seen him in meetings. I didn't think he could do the job. And under the Constitutional Reform Act, the Lord Chancellor doesn't really have a right of veto. You've got a right to defer a recommendation and to ask the Judicial Appointments Commission to look again. If they dig in and they come back to you, then you have no option but to accept it. So it's very.
I think on that case they did dig in, didn't they? And
well, they did, and in the end, it was getting close to an election, and Igor Judge, who was by then the Lord Chief Justice, with whom I had a very good relationship, he said, "Would I mind if I removed my objections?" I listened to what Igor said, and although I'd squared the opposition on this, I wouldn't have gone ahead. I couldn't say that publicly, but I said I wouldn't dreamt of going ahead on something as important as this without squaring the opposition. I thought I'd sort of turn into an election issue.
So are they going to let it go?
On your head be it. Now, in fact, wasn't necessarily right about everything, but I was right about this because I'm afraid
he did have to step down early, didn't he?
He did, and he said he couldn't do
the
the job.
He became unwell, I think.
And it was tragic for him that he was appointed to the job, and then it emerged that he had got serious health problems, one of which I had inadvertently diagnosed.
Yes. I don't think anybody else subsequently has exercised that right to say, look again at the recommended candidate, have they?
No, but I think the JAC and the Lord Chief have been more sensitive.
The Judicial Appointments Commission.
Yes, the Judicial Appointments Commission and the Lord Chief have been more sensitive to considerations which the Lord Chancellor have been advanced.
So you're saying actually the system probably now works because they're more careful about who they put forward and how it happens.
Yeah. And I mean, above all, what people have got to understand, if they're ministers and others, is if you believe in the principle of a separation of powers, you've got to believe in the practice of that. And the practice of the separation of powers means that from time to time, the courts will decide things that you as a minister don't like.
Just coming back to your early life, you qualified as a barrister and you practiced for a short while, but you then chose politics. Why was that?
Let me explain. I had nurtured an ambition to go to the bar. I was brought up as a scholarship kid from a council estate.
You grew up in Essex, didn't you?
I grew up in the suburban.
And 4 of you, I think, or 5 of you in a council flat?
A council masonette, yeah.
Brought up by your mother?
Yeah. But when we luckily, nothing to do with us genetically, we were bright and were good at exams. So I did law at Leeds University. I then got diverted, as it were, into student politics and became president of the National Union of Students. But I'd always had this idea that I'd go to the bar, and I'd eaten all my dinners as a member of the Inner Temple while I was an undergraduate. Towards the end of my 2 years as president of the NUS, I had plenty of offers of really quite attractive jobs in the media and things like that. But I thought, no, Jack, you promised yourself you go to the bar, go to bar school and get the exams, and then with luck you'll find a pupillage and so on. So I went to bar school as I finished at the NUS. I worked the most and the hardest I've ever worked in my life. I worked and worked and worked, and the result of that was that I did extremely well in bar finals. I came third in England, I'm very proud to say.
Yes.
And off the back of that, Inner Temple gave me a scholarship, which was enough to get me through my first 6 months of pupillage. Meanwhile, through contacts, I'd been offered a pupillage in chambers in the Temple. And in those days...
What chambers was it?
Francis Taylor Building.
Oh, yes.
And those days, pupils had to pay their pupil master 100 guineas, about £1,000, more than that, and live on air. So that was why the scholarship that I got, which was very substantial, from the Inner Temple, was critical to me being able to get through my pupillage without starvation. And anyway, I did my first 6 months. Then in the second 6 months, we start to take briefs. That went fine. And then the Chambers offered me a seat in Chambers, a tenancy, which I was delighted by. Did all that. I was on the local council as a Labour councillor, and I'd stood in a dead loss of a Conservative seat, Frust dead loss, which was Tunbridge and Malling. But so I had a kind of idea that I combine law and politics, but without being clear about when that would happen. I mean, there were plenty of members of Parliament who were in practice at the bar at the same time, and that included my head of Chambers, who was a Conservative member of Parliament, Edward Gardner, lovely man. So then what happened was that there was in February 1974, there was a general election, which was the one that Ted Heath lost. Unexpectedly, Labour was asked to form a minority administration, Harold Wilson. Out of the blue, I was asked through Barbara Castle's husband, who I knew a bit, if I'd go and see Barbara. I had no idea why. And she then offered me a job as a political advisor. And I said to her, well, it's very flattering, Mrs. Castle, but I'm just getting my practice going. The briefs were coming in, although the money wasn't.
What kind of law was it going to be that you...
I was doing quite a lot of crime, quite a lot of county court work, contract and tort. My pupil master had done quite a lot of family law, but it didn't really appeal to me. So if I'd carried on, I would have had a general common law practice. And as most of our fellow members of the Chambers practice, and that was how the bar was organised in those days. Far fewer specialists sort of outside the Chancery Division, say planning chambers. So I said to Mrs. Castle, it is really flattering, but you have to give me some time to think about this, because I'm just getting my chambers going, my practices going, and with respect, it wasn't clear at that stage whether the government would last 3 months or 3 weeks, because it was so fragile. And I also said, just so you know, she'd been appointed to run the health and social security systems, one job. I don't know anything more than members of the public about the health and social security system. Oh, it doesn't matter, you'll pick it up, he says. So I then spent a week trying to make up my mind what to do. My former pupil master, who said to me, "No, Jack, I think you should stay at the bar. You've got a great future ahead of you. You can easily get on the High Court bench." And I thought that's probably what was the case. I went to see my head of Chambers, who was a Conservative member of Parliament, and I put my dilemma before him. And he said, "I've got one question to ask you." After I'd laid out my story, he said, "In 20 years' time, would you rather be on the High Court bench or in the British Cabinet?" So I heard myself saying British Cabinet. So he then said, "Well, that's your answer." But he said, "We can make it easy for you. You can stay on the board, carry on as a member of Chambers, pay a reduced rent, and if it doesn't work out with Mrs. Castle, you can come back the next day."
That was good.
Oh, good. It was wonderful.
Yes.
It was the biggest favour I've ever been done.
Yes. And of course, you then, the rest we know, you then went off and had a political career, highly successful.
Yeah. But there was a moment after the 92 election, which I won in Blackburn, but we lost nationally, the fourth loss in a row, where I did think about going back to the bar. I was just young enough to do that.
Did you? Do you regret?
No, I don't.
In any way the decision you made?
No, I don't. I'm incredibly grateful to Edward Gardner, the Conservative member of Parliament. So that was the best career advice I had. But he also made it possible for me, because we had no money.
Quite. If he had not made the offer he did, would you have gone the other way?
Probably I would have stayed at the bar and had a different kind of career.
You mentioned earlier the importance of the rule of law and the respective arms of the Constitution remembering their role and respecting others' positions. Do you think in recent years, looking at recent administrations, or say the last 14 years, do you think there has been a disregard somewhat for the rule of law? We've had the proroguing of Parliament. We've had challenges over the Brexit procedure. What do you feel about it?
Yes, I think they have. I mean, it's depended very much who's been Prime Minister and who's been Lord Chancellor. You're bound to get senior members of the Cabinet irritated by decisions which are made by the judiciary, and vice versa. But what's important is that they should not spill over into an undermining of confidence in the judiciary and the courts by politicians, or vice versa. So nothing significant, I think, happened on this score in the first 5 years of the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition. But it's certainly the case that after that, partly because of Brexit and partly because of the personality of Lord Chancellors, particularly Liz Truss, that and understanding that senior politicians needed to protect the integrity and independence of the courts broke down. And you had the notorious headline in the Daily Mail,
the enemies of the people,
enemies of the people,
which came, of course, after a ruling by the judges that Brexit, the triggering of Brexit, must go before Parliament.
Yes, and of course it had to, and you couldn't resolve it by.
Do you think all that damaged relations? I mean, what do you think from your knowledge? I'm sure you're in contact still with both judges and other politicians. Has that damaged relations between the judiciary and the executive?
It did at the time. I don't think, I mean, right now, I'm quite clearly in Shabana and Mahmood, somebody who's eminently qualified to be Lord Chancellor. You also happen to have a senior Silk QC, you also happen to have a senior Silk KC as Prime Minister. So, yeah, so it's not an issue now. But it was a crucial issue when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister, and indeed going back to when Liz Truss was eccentrically appointed to the position of Lord Chancellor. She was plainly unqualified for this, as Charlie Faulkner has already made clear on your programmes, and out of her depth, but also had no sense at all about the need for there to be a division of responsibilities.
Well, how can that kind of appointment be avoided in future, or can't it?
Well, it should. There is law saying what the qualifications of the Lord Chancellor should be. Why and how the Cabinet Secretary of the day did not point out what the law says to the Prime Minister, I do not know.
Do you think there need to be stronger safeguards? I mean, for example, some people seem to think that aspects of the Lord Chancellor's role, looking after the constitutional parts of it, should be hived off or given to some senior figure in the House of Lords. I don't know.
No, I don't. I mean, no, I'm very much in favour of elected politics, because.
And you, of course, were the first to hold the position from the House of Commons, weren't you?
Since the Tudor period, I think Thomas More was.
That's quite a long time.
Well, also look what happened.
Exactly.
It does go back a long way.
It goes back a long way.
Yeah.
So you don't think we need any changes to the arrangements to safeguard?
I'm afraid I'm contemptuous and irritated by people who say that if there's a problem, it's too important to leave to politicians. I'm sorry, we live in a democracy, and you can't have the big decisions of the day delegated,
decided by the House of Lords.
Yeah, or delegated to some sort of independent quango. Because then there's a question: to whom are they accountable?
I'd like to ask you now about current issues facing politicians and judges. We've got horrendous delays in the courts, court backlogs. And I think one of the things you wanted to do, and it caused a bit of a stir, was to bring in more stipendiary magistrates.
Yes, I wanted to do two things to speed up process in the courts. One was to bring in more stipendiary magistrates, district judges, full-time single justices who were experienced of criminal law.
So these, of course, would be salaried judges sitting on their own, not the 3 volunteer magistrates that we have in most courts throughout the country.
And of course, although I was formally responsible for the magistrates' court, the Lord Chancellor of the day had important responsibilities here, so I couldn't move without, in this case, getting Derry Irvine on board. Where we got to was to get a piece of research done on this. What that showed was that you would indeed speed up the process, particularly for trials. I mean, most cases that go before the magistrates' courts or the Crown courts are for sentencing in practice, for guilty pleas, but the crucial delays often arise in respect of contested matters. So you would speed things up with trials, but what it was also alleging was that you'd get an increase in sentencing if you handed it over to Stipes. Now, I happen to dispute that, but by the time this was, I was in a position to challenge that research, I'd been moved on to become Foreign Secretary.
There was a lot of resistance, wasn't there, too?
The other thing which I was extremely keen to pursue was a recommendation of a 1992 Royal Commission on Criminal Justice, which proposed that this really odd arrangement, which we have in England and Wales, whereby a defendant charged with what's called an either-way offence, which can include theft, various assaults and so on, bulk of them.
So they can be tried in either by magistrates or in the Crown Court by a judge and jury.
Yeah, and that's, amongst others, to the election of the defendant. Now, the Royal Commission said this is really odd. What you're getting is that, serious criminals playing the system, and what you should have is a system by which the forum, in other words, magistrates or the Crown Court, should be determined by the court.
So stripping them of that right to choose, the defendant's right to choose in the cases
so
where
I had a bill on this. The Lords went berserk about this, including quite a lot of Scottish peers or peers who came from Scotland who should have known better, because I kept saying to them, hang on a second, this is the system you've got in Scotland.
Yes.
Oh, no, it's different, they said. But anyway, so this particular provision got knocked out of the bill. I would have had to come back the following year under the Parliament Acts, which I was determined to do if I was still in post. However, I got moved on to become Foreign Secretary, and I think for reasons which I entirely understand, David Blunkett decided to leave it. But it is a ridiculous anomaly that it's still the case that the defendant can choose the mode of trial. And there are those who say, well, you've got more of a chance if you go to the Crown Court. Well, what I'm not sure you have, but what that is also saying is that the quality of justice in the magistrates' court is poor, which I don't accept.
Were you in a position, or you were advising the current government, I don't know whether you do at all, whether that they should look at again, perhaps?
Yes, I mean, you've got to choose your moment for this. But I would certainly go down that route.
Yes.
There'd be a fuss, let me say. It'd be a terrible fuss.
Oh, there would. Yes.
Yeah, and then the waters would close over, because no government, rationally, there is no case whatsoever for giving the defendants a right to decide the forum to play the system. And you just imagine a Justice Secretary going back to Parliament to say, well, what I'm doing today is to give defendants a right to play the system. They wouldn't do it. So I've seen this happen time and time again. People explode. I mean, going right back to some allegedly illiberal changes that Roy Jenkins introduced when he was Home Secretary. For example, majority verdicts on jury trials. If you look at the debates then, you see people were saying it's going to be the end of civilization, all this stuff. All sorts of things, of changes which have been introduced to try and rebalance the system and to reduce the...
And in time, they're accepted. I think your reputation has been quite tough, wasn't it? I mean, you were not on the Liberal wing.
No.
You were a tough Home Secretary and a tough Justice Secretary.
Yeah.
And that's where you positioned yourself in terms of tense sentencing.
Also, one of the reasons, we're all sort of products of where we come from. When I lived on council estate, the people who were most likely to be victims of crime were other people living on council estates. And they were, and typically would have been committed by one or two people living on that kind of estate or similar estates. So, our neighbours were unsentimental about people who committed crime. The neighbours were no less poor than the people committing the crime, often rather more poor than people committing crime. And so we're intolerant about this. And, if it didn't share the view of those living in the leafy suburbs, that this was all fine and you should just be nice to people who are committing crime.
Did you find yourself at odds with the prevailing ethos in many of the judges at that time?
No, not really. I think because they...
Who are considered liberal as a group, if a label can be applied?
I don't know how they vote, but I don't think you could say Igor Judge was liberal. Harry Wolff. I mean, Nick Phillips and Tom Bingham had both not really practiced in criminal law. They were and on the bench, so they were a bit detached. But if you look at their sentencing decisions, they were tough. Mm-hmm. And so this is one of the paradoxes of debates in this field. People will talk about the need of too many people in prison. Fine. To which I say, the number of prisoners is a function of the courts and sentencing guidelines. What you have got to do, if you're saying there are too many people in prison, is to take that prisoner and say, what would you do with him or her instead? Was it reasonable for the courts in that case, not for a minister, to say, we're going to send you for prison for a year or two, or instead you put them back on probation or give them community punishment, when in the majority of cases like that, they will have been through that mill and each time they've considered they've been let off. You stand outside a magistrate's court and listen to the chatter with the people who walk out of court having been, I've been let off, they say. So
exactly. Well, what advice would you give to Shabana Mahmood, looking now, she does, court backlogs, prison overcrowding? What would you be saying to her?
I'm saying I think she's on the right track and drive the best bargain you can from the Treasury.
She has recently turned down the Lady Chief Justice, who wanted more court sitting days. In other words, money for more judges to sit. She's been turned down on that, Lady Carr. Do you think that's a wrong decision?
Well, it was not a wrong decision by Shabana Mahmood. It's a question of educating the Treasury. I mean, there are people in the Treasury, I think it was ever thus, who have a sort of four legs good, two legs bad attitude to public spending. So they'll spend money in some areas, but there is some hostility, institutional hostility in the Treasury to spending money on prisons. And you just got to argue with them. I had a negotiation, this was actually about prison places, which would have transformed the situation and almost did. And there was a young man, cocky young man from the Treasury, who kept coming back to see me with his colleagues to argue about money. Anyway, I had another meeting with him 2 or 3 days later, and I started the meeting by saying, good morning. I had a dream about you last night. I dreamt I'd strangled you. And it's absolutely true. I got so irritated by this cocky young man who sort of typified the worst of the Treasury.
Could I finally ask you a little bit about current foreign affairs, because you've had a long-standing interest and involvement, and as Foreign Secretary, of course, with the Middle East, Iran in particular, and Hamas, with whom I think you actually had discussions with, negotiated with. What's your view of Hamas now?
No, I've never had a formal discussion with Hamas, and indeed I was the original Home Secretary who proscribed Hamas and put it on the list of terrorist organisations along with Hezbollah, the military wings, back in the year 2000 under the Terrorism Act, which was one of my acts as Home Secretary. My view about Hamas now is that they, above all, are responsible for the carnage which is now going on in the Middle East. 1,200 innocent Israeli Jews got murdered by maniacs from Hamas who broke out of the border of the Gaza on the 7th of October 2023. Israel has under 10 million total population, probably about 7 million people who are Jewish in Israel. If you translate that 1,200 for 7 million into UK population terms, you're getting on for 100,000 people being killed in one day by terrorists. Imagine the trauma that would have been produced here if something had happened like that. I mean, it's quite absolutely extraordinary. So I've never had any writ for Benjamin Netanyahu and the very right-wing government which he has, but basically Hamas put themselves beyond the pale.
So what needs to be done what is the solution?
Well, the solution, there needs to be a deal struck. I'm not privy to this, by which Hamas agrees to stop fighting, and he's going to have to agree to stop fighting, and releases those hostages who are still alive, plus the bodies of those who've been killed or who've died in captivity, and there will need to be a longer-term plan to allow the Palestinians to have their own independent state of Palestine, which is both the Gaza and most of the West Bank. Now, this is where, but it would have to be with elements of the Palestinians who are opposed themselves to Hamas. When I talked about the possibility of discussions with Hamas, that was in the context of 2006, where we had, the US particularly, but we were involved. You
were proposing, did you actually never have such discussions?
No, I didn't. But
you were putting it forward as a possibility.
So my view back then was this: we had put pressure on the Palestinian Authority to hold elections in both the Gaza and West Bank, and we openly accepted that Hamas would be one of the parties standing in those elections, along with Fatah. In the event, Hamas got the majority of seats in Gaza. They didn't in the West Bank. My view was that having allowed an organisation like Fatah to stand, it was, on the balance of advantage, it was probably better to talk to them about what they were going to do next and whether you could peel them away from the ballot box and the bullet into just the ballot box, in the same way that we did this with the IRA.
Mm-hmm. And Iran, what about you? A country you know well. What do you feel now about the position they're in, and how long will this regime continue?
The regime, one of the things I've learned is you could never predict whether a revolution is going to be successful until after it's happened. Because you can get very similar circumstances arising. You think, well, it's bound to be a real and permanent upheaval there, but then it's suppressed. As long as Khamenei, the supreme leader, is there, this regime will go on. But it has lost the consent probably of 80% of the Iranian people, and it will never get it back. The Iranian economy is in a terrible way. The society is unhappy. They are losing many of their best people. I mean, their newspapers are actually replete with stories about the efforts that are being made by the administration to stop people travelling abroad so that they aren't losing as many doctors and nurses and engineers. But they are. What you've got is you've got the regime and the people around it, above all the Revolutionary Guards, which is the single most powerful organisation in Iran. And bear in mind that the Revolutionary Guards not only run large part of the military, the best equipped part of the military, but they also run a huge part of the economy. The largest civil engineering company in Iran is owned and run by Revolutionary Guards. Plenty else of industry. Now, the country isn't working properly. You've got these extraordinary social tensions as well, typified by the way that they treat women. But there's also a sort of paradox there, because unlike, say, Afghanistan, above all, women have always been encouraged to go into higher education. So you've got a lot of women, more and more women, who are well educated, like good system of education for them, and they are just furious about the fact they're forced to wear a headscarf. So
you're not going to put a time on it, obviously, but you think...
I don't see that in 20, 30 years' time this regime will be there, unless it changes very, very rapidly and radically, so it's not the same kind of regime.
So how do you spend your time now? You mentioned...
I'm involved in foreign policy. I'm a trustee of the Royal United Services Institute, which is one of the two major foreign policy, defence and security institutions. Think tanks, a couple of other foreign policy think tanks. I am still heavily involved in a couple of charities in my former constituency.
Blackburn Rovers, you still follow them?
I still follow Blackburn Rovers.
But you don't go up there as often?
I don't go up there only because of sitting in Danby Wood Park is literally bad for my lungs, but I follow it.
And I think you said you go to the local church, so you're practicing Christian.
I'm heavily involved in the local church, have been for years and years. Yeah.
Did you?
I never said anything about that when I was a minister.
Is your faith important to you in your politics, or has it been in your political life?
Yes, yeah. But unlike in the US, where people sort of protest their faith,
wear it on a sleeve, which we don't here, do we?
No, quite the reverse. I mean, I always, if somebody starts to wear it on their sleeve here, I think you should feel for your wallet, check your purse.
This podcast was brought to you by the University of Law. Subscribe now to make sure you don't miss the next episode.